Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and as I'm sure you all know, there's plenty of division in this country. I recently read an article from Cato where the article discussed how to get over the current divisions and restore a sense of national unity. And I decided to have one of the authors of the article on the show today. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies and is known for his writing on law, public policy, and regulation. Walter Olson, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. Glad to join you.
Well, division is nothing new in America, right? I mean, we could go back to the Federalists and Anti-Federalists and the Jacksonians. I mean, the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians, and of course, we had a Civil War and the division in the 1960s. One, has it ever though been this bad in terms of the degree to which people are split?
Well, first, you're absolutely right that conflict and division is a theme in every major period of American politics. But there are still cycles and differences. Sometimes it gets closer to violence. Sometimes violence doesn't seem to be a very real danger. Sometimes the polarization is very much between two camps, and sometimes there are multiple camps. So historically, we've gone through just about everything, including, as you say, a civil war. But I think there's a widespread sense, and I think it's correct, that division has gotten worse in some important ways over the last couple of decades. And although it seems far afield, I like to fall back on a polling sequence that is actually part of a larger polling sequence that tries to measure degrees of social amity by asking questions about if someone came along wanting to marry your son or daughter and they were blank, how would you feel about that? And so if you go back to like the 1960s, of course, back then, we all know that the question about race would have led and did lead as recently as more recently than the 60s, like through the 70s and 80s, to huge numbers of people saying they would be very, very upset if their son or daughter wanted to marry across racial lines. Less well remembered now, but very much part of the thinking of those times was that people were also upset by interreligious marriages, so that if someone came along who was of a different Christian denomination or a non-Christian faith, or, heavens forbid, not a religious believer at all, people were also in very large numbers, in very high percentages, upset about that, said that they would be dismayed. And then they asked often in those same polls about what if it were someone of the opposite political party. Well, there people were more mellow. Some of them would be upset at a marriage across political lines, but most of them would not be. Now, you can probably guess about some of the reversals or inversions, as it were, that have happened over the half century or so since then. People have become far more accepting of interracial marriage. Opposition to interreligious marriage has dropped down to being a small minority. People are generally perfectly okay with that. And yet the thing that has gone in the opposite direction is that there are now large numbers of people who would be dismayed if their child married across party political lines. So there you have. I realize that public polls are not exactly the most solid form of scientific evidence, but it's not clear anyone was trying to get these numbers. These numbers just seem to sort of emerge from patterns that a lot of people would have noticed for other reasons, which is that even as America has kind of put behind it some of the sorts of, like Catholic versus Protestant tensions that defined many periods of division in American history. So that party gulf, that political gulf, is taken in a more deadly serious way. People are not just affected by it when it comes to their family life, but they if you switch to polling questions about, for example, is violence likely to be justified, in American history? I don't remember the exact phrasing, but a forward-looking question about, do you think things might reach the point where violence will be justified? I think that's a better paraphrase of the sort of things they were fishing for. And again, one of the interesting things is that even back in periods in which, and I'm old enough to remember the early 70s, where there were several thousand political bombings a year. I mean, it's just wild when you think about how much more actual violence in some dimensions, in which there had been a bunch of, assassinations of the highest possible profile, so that for a while America kind of was um, mentally defining itself as a place where political assassinations went on all the time. Now, those trends happily uh, did not last. The political assassinations went out of fashion for whatever reason. It's another show, and the and the bombings were terminated in part through the apprehension, occasionally through the retirement from terrorism of people who have been setting bombs in various places. Nonetheless, even at those times, when those sorts of things were happening, many of the indicators of general polarization were not as bad, in part because those horrible things were being pursued only by a very, very tiny percentage of the population, not by either political party as a matter of its own wider policy.
Now, in earlier periods of divisiveness, for instance, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists clashed over whether or not to have a constitution at all, or whether or not to do away with the Articles of Confederation and implement the Constitution. Then they clashed over whether there should be a Bill of Rights. The Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians, they clashed over the relative roles of state and federal government, whether there should be a national bank. Of course, the Civil War, we had slavery. And in the 60s, there was the Civil Rights Act, and the Great Society, the Vietnam War. But the current divisiveness seems to me far more tribal and less ideological and policy based. First of all, do you see the same thing? And if so, why has that occurred? And if not, explain why I'm mistaken.
Well, I don't think you're mistaken. I think you picked up on a very important difference between polarization then and now, which is that it tended to be polarization around um, uh, highly practical lines in which, for example, just to take one movement almost at random, the radical prairie populism that was important in the late 19th century had very specific things that it wanted to do. It wanted to alter how the currency was managed by the federal government. It wanted specific controls on railroads. It had a bunch of different things that were preached as a platform. And you and I are not the first. Political scientists have been kind of scratching their heads for years now about the fact that the more angry we get between red and blue sides, the less programmatic difference is being argued over, as the red side has kind of dropped many of the demands for smaller government and skepticism about big government spending and things that it once would have viewed as core precepts, and dropped a bunch of other things too, having to do with foreign policy, and we could go on. And although there is more programmatic content to the blue tribe, the left tribe, in that you still can find some issues like extending government health insurance and for free pre-care, free daycare and various other things. So there's more of that, but compared with what it used to be, there is also just a lot more tribal signaling, and I think we're going to get back to that word tribal because unfortunately it explains and provides an image for a lot. And so again, political scientists fascinated by the fact that the angrier people get, the less they can articulate exactly how their program differs from the other sides. They have done rather fun experiments in which they, for example, quiz people about an issue. And as we know, Donald Trump, a Republican, has gotten behind certain types of, big welfare and social insurance programs, but so did George W. Bush before him. It's not as if Trump invented that. So they present something often having to do with uh, an expanded government responsibility to in some social insurance area. And they describe it as being the view of the Democratic Party. And the people polled polarize one way, and then they take the other half of the sample and they present that same proposal, word for word, as a proposal of the Republican Party or Donald Trump. And they polarize the opposite way. All of these liberals who are supposed to favor the policy in principle get much more suspicious if they believe it's come from the Republican side. Oh, it's some sort of sneaky subterfuge to do something. So they all of a sudden support for that government expansion drops drastically. And of course, exactly the opposite is happening on the Republican side. Now, this is not well calculated to bolster your confidence in how carefully either side is thinking through their issue commitments. It's instead pointing to the idea that people are often making their commitments to one side or the other based on something other than policy content, and then sort of, is retconning the right word? They are going back and retroactively deciding that they are enthusiastic about the policy proposals of that side. So someone who has joined the either tribe based on other sorts of sometimes emotional, sometimes identity-based commitments, sometimes a feeling that this other group, this opposite group, is out to get me in some way. It then becomes comfortable to readjust your views on things that were never your main issue in the first place, whether it be healthcare or housing or foreign policy, and say, yeah, my side seems like they're making sense. I'm going to get a little more committed to my side's preachings on issues that I don't know all that much about.
I've mentioned this on the show before because when it happened, it left such an indelible mark on my mind. And it's something that's politically really insignificant. But years ago, Roger Clemens testified before Congress about the steroid scandal in baseball. And all the Republicans took Clemens' side, and all the Democrats went against him. There was absolutely no reason why that should happen. It wasn't a political issue, but yet the parties nonetheless divided themselves. And it seems like that, like you said, I remember when Trump was in office and he introduced the COVID vaccines, hearing Democrats say, I wouldn't take that thing, coming from Trump, it was rushed. And then once Biden got into office, it was trust the science. You got
Oh,
to
yeah.
take the vaccine. It's just insane. And the thing is, I'm not a fan of the word gaslighting because I feel it's used far too much. But nonetheless, I feel sometimes like people are trying to make me think I'm nuts. I mean, I'll say something about Kamala Harris, and the next thing you know, I'm told all you do is listen to Fox News and Newsmax, and neither of which I watch. And it's the same thing on the other side. If I criticize Trump, I'm immediately like rushed with you have Trump derangement syndrome, you're a communist. And when I point out to him, look, I'll put my capitalism credentials up against any of you. But it doesn't matter. You oppose Trump, you oppose capitalism, you're a communist. It just how I don't know how I could do, I don't know if it can be answered even, but how does that happen?
Well, I have had every one of those conversations that you mentioned. They have all happened to me too. And of course, with the Cato Institute, which tries to cover generally, individual liberty-oriented issues across a wide range, they say that not only am I a communist, but that Cato is communist. Now, okay, I don't know how one disproves that, other than just sort of saying, please do a Google search, that sample, sample the word capitalism in either my, collection of writings or Cato's. But that somehow misses the point. That's not what they want to hear in response. What they want to hear in response is that, you're so right. This is a grand battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. I was a little bit heretical and strayed into thinking that maybe something Kamala Harris said made sense, or something that Donald Trump said makes sense. And occasionally, even though I recognize the limitations of both those figures, occasionally either of them will say something. But when I say that, it's at that point that I get hopped on as, oh, see, you are a Trumpist after all. No, no, no. He may have endorsed a good policy, and I don't want to falsify. That I think for everyone, but certainly in the think tank business, it comes back to you that if you start falsifying things or falsifying your own view of things, why are you in that business? The whole idea is to bring your most accurate and best estimate to the listeners or the public of what's happening in some area, whether a particular proposal is bad or good. And once you start either it's bad enough to pull back and stop talking about something, but far worse to falsify the likely consequences of a policy or something else just because it's been endorsed by the side that you especially dislike.
What do you think? First of all, what have been some of the consequences of this divisiveness, and what are some potential consequences that worry you?
Well, the consequences, I think, have been far-reaching. We talk about the lack of public trust in institutions that once commanded it, but particularly among the institutions that are devoted in some way to knowledge. Loss of public trust in journalism, loss of public trust in academia, loss of public trust in well-known public figures. And somewhere, although there are multiple causes for these things, and part of it is that anti-expertise populism has been preaching and trying to say, you can't trust anyone who comes from a medical school to, speak honestly about vaccines or whatever. Yeah, that's some of it. But part of it is also that the people who have attained positions of eminence in these various fields have sometimes been led astray into thinking that they too have responsibilities to a team, that a bit of complexity or nuance or concession about, yes, this is generally a good thing medically, but there are sometimes side effects or there are sometimes contraindications. So, don't treat this as either a cure-all or a, universal toxin. Those sorts of uh, uh, complications which better acknowledge the actual scientific shape of the issue or the actual policy shape, if you're talking about whether a government policy will always have uniformly bad effects. Sometimes you have to say, no, it will probably be felt as having good effects for a couple of identifiable groups, but it's just bad as an overall thing for society. And making those concessions can seem like too much uh, of a concession to the quote bad guys or the wrong side or whatever. And so people turn themselves into cheerleaders for a team. And obviously there's some role for cheerleaders for a team. I prefer if they are in uniforms that reveal them immediately to be cheerleaders so that we don't have to take the chance seriously. But if you are in serious writing, if you are in academia, if you are a spokesman for science, you ought not to be a cheerleader for a side. You should be a cheerleader for truth, perhaps. That's a better definition. But you should not be trimming the truth as you present it because you want one side to win, even if it's legitimate to want one side to win.
You brought up an excellent point about this mistrust of experts. And certainly there's been experts that have warranted a lack of trust. This has happened, it's been going on in the media for as long as I've been paying attention. And of course, recently with COVID and the recommendations and they change and whatnot. And it seemed to me like during that time, a big problem wasn't necessarily that scientists changed their minds. That happens. It's that they presented it with such an absolute certainty and authority that when you then change your mind, it gives the impression that you can't be trusted. But the interesting thing to me isn't the mistrust of the experts, because that's just a negative. I don't trust what they're saying. But what has happened is now people plug in an alternative reality and say, you can't believe that. This is what actually occurred. And the case for not trusting is far stronger than the case for the invoked reality. And I wonder, does that play any part in the division? Because when that happens to me, for instance, and someone tells me that, and an example is always they use the media. Oh, you just believe the media. No, actually, I don't. But that doesn't mean that I got to believe the guy on YouTube either that I don't know, and I don't know his sources. Nor do I have to believe your claims from a meme on social media. Not trusting that doesn't mean that I then turn around and I trust, Katie Couric or whoever is bringing the news. But when people buy into that, and I had a very personal thing with a friend of mine who were no longer friends over this sort of thing, does that increase the division when people believe they have sort of access to this truth and other people won't accept it? It seems like that is grounds for severe conflict.
Yeah, it there was a line from a thinker who I nearly always disagree with, G.K. Chesterton, about when people stop believing in something, the problem is that they believe in nothing. It's that they'll believe in anything. And when people uh, go further down, what begins as a healthy amount of skepticism about the fact that science does change its mind perfectly legitimately, and that academia sometimes, comes out with bad theories and ideas, and we need to be on our watch against them, and on down through the other institutions. But if they completely discredit the scientific method, if they completely discredit the controls, such as layers of editing and the correction process that the professional media still, in many instances, tries to bind itself to, then they miss the fact that the thing that they wander off to instead typically lacks those um, imperfect and never fully functional correction mechanisms. And you mentioned memes. I would love to just spend a minute on memes because I hope that I'm right in saying that I'm seeing fewer memes this year than in previous political cycles. I hope, because I have done my best to educate people about categorically why you are more likely to be misled if your diet consists of memes than if your diet consists of links to articles that aspire to a permanent presence on the web. One of them is that if you are reading something that is sourced to a particular uh, article on on whatever, medical or scientific or for that matter, ideological things, you can do a quick search to see what responses there have been to that article. Those will usually turn up in a search. If it is an online publication, you can very often find a comment section in which at least someone has noticed the glaring error and points it out if there's a glaring error in the piece. And of course, you can find often a correction thing, or you can simply find that this fact that was being presented to you is actually 8 years old. It's not from this year. And that the way the meme was set up, which typically cuts off dates and things because meme circulates better if it has no identifying dates. It can keep circulating that way 8 years later. It may appear in a completely different light if the thing happened 8 years ago. So memes tend to cut off all of the different ways in which you can check the information easily. And links, on the other hand, don't always give you all of them, but you have a fighting chance of getting at least 2 or 3 of the ways of finding out if someone completely refuted this thing or if it's completely outdated and intervening events have falsified it, even if it was true at the time. So, um, so I make myself a nuisance to people because they like sharing memes, and they don't like my coming in as the party pooper. But I hope, I have to hope that there is a public learning curve in which you get burned often enough by looking foolish in front of your friends. And let's face it, so much of social media sharing consists of wanting to come off in a good light in front of your friends. Well, if the cigar blows up enough times in your face, maybe you won't check it more carefully beforehand. Anyway, so that's why I hope that we have passed the peak of meme usage.
That'd be nice. I think there's little doubt that politicians play a large role in this divisiveness. And I used to support the Republican candidate. I'm not a Republican, but I felt like the Republican candidate, at least in, the rhetoric they would use, were more in aligned with the values that I supported. And I would just listen to the news, and you would hear people say, well, if you support tax cuts, you're against the poor. Or if you want to end entitlements, you're trying to increase poverty. You're against affirmative action. You're a racist. And the critiques necessarily neglected the fact that even if you think I'm wrong, right? The point is, I think that low taxes, getting rid of regulation, getting rid of entitlements are good for people. Now, you may argue that I'm wrong, and that's fine. That's an argument that can be had. But when you automatically assume a result is going to happen and that I'm intending that result to happen, it's dishonest and it can anger a person. So I mentioned earlier the sort of conspiracy thinking that is largely identified with the right, but that type of rhetoric has been coming from the left for a long time. Of course, they're pushing grandma off the cliff in the wheelchair, or, Romney's this cruel businessman. He hates poor people, whatever. What role do you think, or what's the comparative role, I should say, between politicians engaging in that rhetoric, talk radio and social media influencers, and your average citizens? Who bears the brunt of the responsibility?
Well, that's a big question. And as far as responsibility for taking the what I call the demagogic approach to argument of the people that you were describing, where attempts to bring some fiscal reality into discussion of entitlement programs turns into you want to starve grandma. Please look at these tables of projected expenditures. Why don't we discuss these tables of projected expenditures and see whether you think they're sustainable? That derives from human nature, and unfortunately, demagogy has been going on throughout American history and other countries, and we're not going to fix it as such. And that brings up the question of, okay, assuming that you see through the demagogy and recognize that the issues are more complicated and interesting, how should we behave? Should we be counter-demagogic? Should we be should we be unwilling to take the bait and unwilling to be indignant even after we've just been called some very unkind name, about grandma starvers or whatever the thing is? And there is probably no single best prescription. Part of it depends on our personality. Some of us have combative personalities. Some of us have a great deal of sensitivity to being insulted. I try to follow without ever actually fully succeeding, try to follow the example of Milton Friedman, who approached these sorts of things. And of course, his views were attacked in exactly all of those ways, especially since he concentrated typically on domestic economic issues. People would fling all these things at him, and he would smile and be good-natured and say, that's all very well, but let's look at the actual consequences of the policy. And before they could stop him, he was on to discussing, and of course, he had tons of numbers at his command, and was in a Nobel Prize winning economist, so they may have kept quiet long enough for him to explain what the actual measured consequences of the policy were, how poverty rates, for example, differed between places that had pursued one policy and places that had not pursued that same policy, and gradually get the materials on the table, which might not necessarily change people's first principle thinking. That's one of the critiques, of course, that was often made of Milton, was that he was just turning arrogant left-wingers into humble left-wingers who realized that they had to actually check whether the numbers came out and whether the policies worked as intended, but they still remain liberals. I think Milton would have seen that as being actually a great advance for the welfare of the society to have moved them from the one position to the other, but it didn't necessarily move them on first principles. And so you've got the opposite point of view, of course, which says, no, the important wins you make in persuasion is when you change people's first principles to the point where they can then figure out the rest of it for themselves or whatever, and again, I've seen enough of argument to know that general prescriptions always fall a little bit flat. Some people are just great at arguing first principles, and I'm not going to get in their way as they do that. But for so many of the practical consequences, or some of the practical debates that we get into about the role and size of government, the part of what I have tried to do throughout my career, and I think one of the reasons why the Cato Institute is effective, is that it isn't just talking to those who already agree with us on first principles. It is always reaching out to say, look, even if we don't agree on some very important things, there are a bunch of other things that we do agree on. In the case of the economy, we want there to be a more productive economy because it is going to make the poor better off to live in a society with a more productive economy. To get back for a moment to the issue of political division, you won't reach everyone, but you can reach a lot of people by saying, look, we need to arrange things so that violence between citizens on the street is not what people turn to resolve political issues. Let's see how much we can agree on in trying to keep things to a peaceful a political process and away from the threat of violence. You can't get all the way to full agreement, but you can get some important territory covered.
Now, in the paper that you co-authored, you and your co-authors elucidate some principles or some ideas on how to move forward and attain some semblance of national unity. What are some things that you recommend that us, people as individuals can do?
Well, if memory serves, we started with violence. And of course, it's easy to say, don't commit acts of violence. Most people who would bother to read our op-eds are not actually in the class that is considering acts of violence. But most of them do get a role, at least as spectators and commenters, when public figures seem to be either encouraging or at least morally inert to violence. When some act of violence occurs and we see people, perhaps even people we know and like, saying, next time I wish they'd, finish the job or whatever the horrible thing is. And so it's at that point when people are, when people who do have some public platform are defending the rioters or defending the um, uh, vandals or whatever, is for you to say, um, well, that isn't my view, and I am so glad that my opponent was not injured by the attack, or I'm so glad that they did not succeed at the effort at arson or that, and this leads directly into other things the individuals can do as they talk with others. One of which is to recognize that although we have different views about law, and I have I've strong sympathies in many ways with those who would like law to be tempered by mercy and by considerations of, sometimes you don't want to go with maximally punitive remedies. Nonetheless, we should recognize that political violence, vandalism, rioting, and the like, even when, or should I say, especially when done in a cause that we may have some sympathy for, needs to be met with legal response that deters it from happening again. And so that's one is, and here you are getting into areas that not everyone practices. Not everyone, is willing to object if all of the rioters manage to beat the charges, as fairly regularly happens when it's a political riot. People get arrested and then the charges are dropped 3 months later. And the and a second half of that is that we should be looking at our leaders whether elected political leaders or thought and opinion leaders, and holding them to a higher standard. It's one thing if our neighbor down the street stays quiet about something we wish they would speak out on. It's another thing when someone whose whole position in public life is that they are supposed to represent a whole lot of other people stays silent on something they really should speak out on. We are entitled to press them to say, come on, at least put out a statement that that this doesn't represent people like you and me. That you hope that the law is fully enforced, or whatever it needs to be said in the situation. So there you have things that you can do, even if you were never likely to engage in any violence yourself. You can be a moral force for nonviolence in solving political differences. Then you go on. My favorite in some ways among the whole seven, because I think that it's not among the more obvious ones to many people reading it, but is among the most important ones, is to approach discussions of these things with individualism. And what I mean by that is to train yourself not to say that they did something. In the weeks since the attempt to assassinate Donald Trump, for example, senators who really ought to know better have gotten up before audiences and said they tried to kill Donald Trump. Well, wait a minute, who is they? And this is something that both sides disgrace themselves on. You see again and again and again, commentators from the more progressive side saying that Republicans do blank. And it turns out that they found three commentators, from the extreme right fringe who were willing to say something, totally heartless or unhuman. Well, no, it isn't all Republicans who said that horrible thing. Most Republicans don't even know what was said. So when you want to condemn, and there's nothing wrong with condemning, be very specific about who committed the thing and never generalize into a group. If you could instead say, some people on the other side, went so far as to do this, or some elected officials have actually, been unwilling to condemn. Never assume that it's the whole group. And once you do that, it's good discipline because you will begin recognizing that, in fact, some of the people on the other side did do the right thing. And that's an important step, recognizing that the other side is not a monolith of evil, but consists of some people who are really pretty horrendous, and then a long spectrum of people who have more of a mix, and then to people who, actually, take their morality pretty seriously and are on your side in condemning some of the same bad behavior. That's an important recognition. It's important not only because it makes you less polarized and less of a feeling that the whole society is going to be destroyed if any power is ever held by the other side, but it also opens up fruitful dialogues because you may be able to reach out to people of some opposing premises and say, hey, how about if we worked on a bill and we talk in our op-ed about election workers. And this is one of the scary and tragic things. It's also happening to judges and prosecutors and juries, and that's a separate horrible thing. But we happen to be all specialists in election issues. And so the fact that in many states, as many as a third of longtime election administrators have quit their jobs, typically low-paying public service jobs running elections, because the volume of death threats and people invading their offices and fear that something will happen to their families is such, that people see this, the low pay to be a county election director. And they say, why on earth shouldn't I move over and become Parks and Rec director instead? And so you lose these people, and of course that increases the chance that elections are going to be run with more mistakes and more inefficiency and perhaps even less reliability because you've got a bunch of newcomers who haven't been had the time to be trained properly by a succession process. So although I want the federal government not to lead the way because I'm a believer in the traditional constitutional structures, but I do see and am willing to cautiously lend my voice when states themselves say, look, we've made things misdemeanors that we probably should have made felonies in a period in which this is causing such very serious amounts of fear, and we can knock them back to misdemeanors if the problem goes away, but we may need to boost them to felonies. These are areas days where you get together with people across the political aisle, and whenever we are in those conversations, I make sure that the First Amendment has a passionate, ardent advocate. I say, you simply cannot punish people for things, however horrible, however hateful, but that are speech without those additional exceptional areas of true threat and things like that. There is to be no punishment. So laws, as we look at possible legal revision, stay away from First Amendment protected stuff. And I think it's actually quite valuable to have someone from a group like Cato that has the long, long, deep commitment to First Amendment uh, values that we do as part of these conversations. It helps to save the other side from doing things which, they often realize after you talk to them that if only to keep from being struck down by the Supreme Court, they shouldn't mess with speech.
How optimistic are you that the divisions can be healed to any significant extent?
Well, here's where you can take some comfort and hope from history, because, of course, the periods in which people were horribly divided, and that definitely includes political violence in America. There have been American elections in which hundreds of people were killed, during the electoral process for, showing up at the polling place when people knew they would vote the wrong way and so forth. These periods have given way to more peaceful periods. Now, one thing I haven't done, and I'm not sure anyone has done a convincing job, is to go back, look carefully at these periods, which tend not to be written about as much because they are, by definition, the periods in which exciting violence is yielding to less exciting nonviolence. But nonetheless, what was happening during those periods? I'm sure in some of those periods, what was happening was that the felt grievances had been removed by one side winning, or by one side making concessions that changed policy so that people who were marching in the streets for something and getting violent. I mean, the one example that uh, if people remember the women's suffrage movement, there was a period, particularly in England, but also to some extent here, where the advocates for the women's suffrage movement were destroying works of art and were blocking traffic and various other things that we now associate with completely different causes. And I'm a rule of law guy, and so if I were magically transported back then, I would be disapproving and saying, look, make your arguments in a rational way. Do not destroy a work of art or set off a bomb or whatever. Nonetheless, that particular grievance was obviously um, uh, settled when we passed the amendment for women's suffrage, and went away, and there were no more acts of disruption of that sort. But that can't always happen, obviously. Sometimes it's not something where a cause can either definitively lose or definitively win. It's somewhere in between that it's got to come out. And then how do the divisions get ameliorated? Uh, I don't think this is necessarily a cynical view to say that sometimes other divisions come along and seem more important, and people drop the divisions that they were obsessed with for a while because they are attracted by a flashy new division that they can pursue instead, getting them mad at a completely different set of people, though perhaps overlapping, than the group they were mad at the first time. It is certainly um, true, though, that we mentioned earlier in the program that the content of issues that people are upset about rotates fairly fast. We've seen it rotate. In our own last 10 or 15 years, we've seen significant rotation in the issues people are mad about, and issues that they once. I remember when. Um, After the Obergefell decision in the Supreme Court, you had a bunch of well-known conservatives saying that the American legal and political regime had become illegitimate, that we were now dealing with an illegitimate regime because that case had come out differently than they liked. Well, it sounds silly now. Now, to me, of course, it sounded silly back then, but but even they have moved on. They typically, in part because public opinion has changed on the underlying issue, in part because many things have happened since that they probably accurately view as much more threatening to their interests as religious conservatives or whatever. So people people move on from old causes, and whether that results in some sort of law of conservation of enmity, where they have to be just as angry, but they direct it at new people. But I'm not going to say, because I think, in fact, people sometimes just become less angry. Certainly, you see that in individuals, and I think when I remember and I grew up close enough to the 1960s that I remember that perfectly normal people would get up at gatherings of dinners or whatever and say that they thought the American regime was illegitimate, and they hoped that not only would Ho Chi Minh win in Vietnam, but that we would have some American Ho Chi Minh. It's to scream, and yet these same people had turned into moderates, within 10 or 15 years. I like to hope that this process of personal maturation is somehow matched by, matched in writ large among larger groups.
All right, Walter, anything that we didn't cover that you think we should have in regards to this topic?
Not offhand. Happy to uh, go somewhere else if you think something's been missing, but otherwise it's
I
fine.
don't think so, but I wasn't sure. So where can people find you?
Okay, if you search my name, and that's Walter Olson, Olson, you can search at the Cato Institute, where I've got a page where it's far more than you will ever want to read about many, many subjects. These days, often about election law, but historically, I've written about so many topics in regulation and constitutional law and free speech and so forth. But so you can find it there. I have 4 books, which you probably will have to go on to used book sites to get. The Litigation Explosion was my first and most successful, about why our rules encourage us to sue each other so much. And then the 3 successive ones were The Excuse Factory about labor and employment law, The Rule of Lawyers about mass tort litigation, where people sue on behalf of a million people at once in one courtroom, and then Schools for Misrule, which is about bad ideas from the law schools. And unfortunately, although there is much that law schools do that is absolutely necessary, the higher you go, the more you get into professors who've come up with some truly bad ideas that have had truly baneful influences on this country and others. And that's what that book mostly gets into.
I got to tell you, I read The Rule of Lawyers, and I thought
Ah,
when I was incarcerated and I read it, and it had a
wow.
great impact on me. I did not know that you wrote that book when I asked you
Oh,
to come
thank you
on
so
the
much.
show.
Thank you so much. It is always so meaningful when someone says they've read one of my books. It is as if we have already spent dozens of hours together.
Yes.
I didn't know it, but we were spending all that time together.
Yeah, great book. I recommend it. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure entirely.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Till next time.